Sun is right there. Yeah, it's fine.
So after all this inspiring keynote session and also the panel in the morning, we'll continue with session 9, gender disparities in employment security and old age security, and intersection of gender work status and political ideology. We have again wonderful presenters, Christian Weller from UMass Boston, and Nthabiseng Moleko, and Ipek will be the third presenter. So we'll have 15 minutes each. 5 minutes before.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Christian Weller. I'm a professor at UMass Boston in the Public Policy, Public Affairs Department. I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and this is joint work with another senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Her name is Beth Almeida. In the interest of full disclosure, I need to say that, or I should say, that Beth is my wife. My primary areas of expertise are actually wealth inequality, retirement policy. This is sort of how we got into aging, or how I got into aging, and economic policy in general. I've been with the Center for American Progress for over 20 years and sort of played macroeconomist now and then. This entire conference is a little bit of, takes me back in time. So many, seeing so many friends, colleagues from UMass Amherst, the new school, together. And when I got out of grad school, or in my grad school, I actually did some work on international finance and economic development. Nobody wanted me to do that in the think tank world in Washington, DC. So I had to figure out something else to earn my keep. Let me just say a little bit more. I'm going to rush through the paper in relatively quickly. So I'm going to spend a little time now to say why we did this paper. We're focusing on what's happening to older women, defined as those 55 and older, in the American labor market. Part of the mission here, or the goal of us writing this report, is not just simply shining a light on the financial insecurities and the policies that can alleviate those for older women, but also to sort of continue to push, especially the American left. You can figure out where politically the Center for American Progress stands. So, away from ageism. Ageism is sort of the one form of discrimination that's completely acceptable. To give you an example, without naming names, I work for an anti-racist health promoting university. It's our logo, it's on our state. Yet in a chairs meeting last year, it was completely acceptable for multiple chairs to mock an older gentleman who had been the photographer of the university. And in that joking about him, age and inability to work were equated. That happens all the time. Anybody here with kids? Many of us have kids, especially in the American school system. The American school system, you have the 100 days. It's like exactly the half point in the year. And usually, luckily, we're moving away from that, but teachers would say, dress up like a 100-year-old. And my son would come home, he's like, well, I'm gonna wear a wig and I'm gonna walk unsteadily and I cough. I'm like, have you ever met a 100-year-old? And he's like, no. The problem was, the issue is, he actually had a 100-year-old friend. His friend Bill was 102 when he was in kindergarten. And Bill didn't walk with a cane, he was not unsteady. So we actually made my son dress up as a 100-year-old firefighter. But it existed, we looked it up. But those kinds of things are common and they feed back into policy. And especially when you look at the intersection of gender and age, they sort of translate into bad economic policy, horrible economic politics. I know most of you don't live in the United States, so this first reference here is to our currently awful politics. The Republican candidate for Vice President J.D. Vance was on a show a few years ago where the host said, the whole purpose of postmenopausal women is to essentially leave the labor force and take care of children. And JD Vance agreed with it, and that sort of became a flap on social media. The problem was, at least for us who are interested in policy, that there wasn't sort of a good narrative against that. That there wasn't, and this is why we did it, that older women, older gentlemen may want or need to work longer. And policies need to support that through multiple channels. But that sort of isn't part of the narrative because that ageism and sexism are overlaying in the policy and the political world in the United States. What that means is that the invisibility, especially of older women in the labor force, means massive economic insecurity, especially for women 75 and older, especially those who've never been married. Their poverty rates are more than twice as high as they are for all older people in the United States. And it takes away attention from policies because older women are not visible in the debate, other than when a flub from somebody like this happens. There aren't really serious policy conversations about making sure that older women have the financial economic security that they deserve after a whole career. Okay, there are a number of policy tools. And before I go into the policy tools, I forgot to say, nothing I say here should be attributed to the Center for American Progress. While this is a report that we published with the center, I'm going to go a little bit more into some policies that the center hasn't taken a stance on one way or the other. Like, I don't think they would oppose it, but they haven't really said anything in support. We looked at some data, we have some data in it. We actually looked at data a ton. We played around with the data a ton. We didn't include everything we had. The one thing we wanted to highlight here is that career earnings, these are usual typical earnings for full-time wage and salary workers. They peak earlier for women. We did this as a cross-sectional analysis. We did this with synthetic cohorts. It comes out the same. It doesn't matter. This is cross-sectional. So for men, it peaks around 50 in their early 50s. For women, it peaks a lot earlier, about 10 years earlier. What that means is you not only have a wage gap, but you have a wage gap that grows over time. That means it is harder for women to save for retirement, and they ultimately will end up with lower Social Security, which is our US-based public retirement system. We also use, this is data from those of you who do work in the United States. You might know this data set. It's the Federal Reserve's Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, which is designed to capture a lot of financial insecurity metrics. There are a number of questions that are related to job quality and job mobility. Asked for a raise, promotion, received a raise or promotion, applied for a new job, started a job, any of the above. The point, this like orangey dot, the furthest to the left, that's older women. So no matter what, right? And we know what these are, right? If women, especially older women, ask for a raise, for promotion, they're seen as pejoratively as uppity, unruly, sort of disturbing the peace, right? Like, well, for a man of the same age, it probably would be seen as assertive and confident and yes, a leadership quality. We know all of them. So, but the point here is really just showing that started a new job, applied for a new job, you're less than 10%. Same with raises and other things. It's just confirming what I just showed. Age discrimination. Age discrimination is one of those things that is extremely difficult to measure, at least in some of the data. Generally, the way the literature has done on age discrimination, they're going back to reports of age discrimination, and then basically lawyers investigate the cases. There's a number of ways. What generally, one of the findings is that self-reported cases, like what people report, heavily overlays with what we see in other surveys where people just simply reported whether they've been treated unfairly in a discriminatory way, which is a question or was a question in the survey of household economics and decision making. So, and it had questions on, have you been treated unfairly or in a discriminatory way on the job? We did not include the data because it would have taken us too long to explain, like to figure out, okay, well, it doesn't happen that often for older women simply because when they're discriminated against, they just simply leave the labor force. Age discrimination impedes re-employment. So just 62.3% of women ages 55 to 64 and 30% of older women 65 and older, which is the fastest growing population in the labor market, found successful re-employment compared to 76% of men ages 25 to 54. So it's particularly on the re-employment side. The other part we should say about, because age discrimination, especially coupled with gender discrimination for older women in the labor market is so pervasive, and because women haven't had enough time, enough earnings to the same degree as men have to build up as reserves, they will be more likely to accept whatever job comes along, no matter how much less it pays and fewer benefits it has, thereby exacerbating a bad situation. But there aren't enough resources, and it has to do, for instance, with the fact that the unemployment insurance system in the United States is for the dogs. There's no other way of saying that. That's technical. So, all right. The other part, skipping. Oh, sorry. I skipped this one, but it doesn't matter. The other part is women are concentrated in low-wage professions. We talked to a number of people and looked at, so the biggest group is office administrative support. 13% of all older women are employed in that, and they make up almost 90% in that jobs. Retail sales, it's a little bit more balanced in terms of gender, even among teachers, and the teachers here include childcare teachers. That's 6% of the total female labor force over 55. But as you can see on the right-hand side, most of these occupations, these low-wage occupations, are heavily dominated by women. Again, and that has to do with long-standing occupational segregation that goes back to even the educational system. Just had to tell my students about, what's it called, compensating differential. That there are, in fact, conservative economists these days that will say, like, women should be paid less if they're in childcare because it's so wonderful, because they get to enjoy what they love doing, while the stockbroker down on Wall Street hates their job and we need to pay them more. My students burst out laughing. I said, like, you need to look this up. Give you the name. I need to give you the names of the economists who actually write this stuff to us. All right. Caregiving responsibilities. This is sort of where we're going to now go into the area where the Center for American Progress hasn't said much about it. That has nothing to do with the centers not wanting to say something. It's just simply we don't have the capacity. The other part is it's a massive undertaking. Women ages 55 and older are 5 times more likely than men of the same age to have a caregiving affect their labor market status. And here, really want to come back to something that was said earlier. When we talk about care, Beth and I, we really mean care comprehensively. This is not about childcare only. Childcare plays a role. It plays an increasing role in the United States because of the opioid crisis. That means grandparents, particularly grandmothers, have to take over because their kids can no longer take care of their kids, of the grandkids. But the other part is also caregiving responsibility for an ailing spouse, for parents and grandparents, happens pretty much in midlife. It affected my wife, her sister-in-law, me, when my mother-in-law got sick with early onset Alzheimer's, right? That kind of stuff happens all the time. It's severe. And when we talk about care, and this is one of the things we sort of mentioned in this report, one of the things we want to get through is caregiving. Like, everybody immediately goes to childcare. It has to be beyond that. We have to build a care infrastructure that acknowledges the fact that we're living in an aging society, especially in the northeastern United States, and that we're living in a society, at least in the United States, where we have growing incidences of disability at all ages in the aftermath of the pandemic. What are we going to do about it? Improving job quality and income security directly. That's higher minimum wages, eliminate tipped and sub-minimum wages, expand earned income tax credits. Want something I didn't know, we have an earned income tax credit in the United States. That is, if you earn money and you're in low-wage labor market, you file your taxes, you get some extra money. Unless you're 65 and older, then you get nothing. There is an age cap under the federal law. And it's also an age cap at the bottom. If you're 18 and younger, you don't get anything. We changed that during the pandemic. Let's bring it back. It doesn't cost much, but it would make a major difference. Paid family and medical leave, we have it at the state. California, New Jersey, Massachusetts are some of the states that have it. There's a big push to make this happen federally. All right, ending age discrimination. Stronger laws, there's a whole host of stronger laws, but basically what we need in the United States is pass the Equal Rights Amendment under the Constitution. It's been introduced for over 50 years, and there's it's caught up in the courts, but leveling equal rights and the protections as part of the Constitution would ultimately be a much bigger lever in terms of eliminating discrimination. Fair access to training and upskilling. Older women, older men like to do more training, but they often don't get access. Their employers doesn't offer it. The argument is like, well, they're going to retire in 5 to 7 years anyway. Except the tenure for somebody who's less than 25 years is 2 years. Why do you send them to training? Like, talk about economic efficiency. You should give all your training dollars to the people who will stay with you, meaning to your older workers. All right. Support for caregivers. Improve care infrastructure. Beth and I wrote a report for an organization called Leading Age. It's the only report where this has happened. I say it because this is sort of my justification if I could retire. It was the one report that the White House cited when they pushed for $400 billion in expanded care infrastructure. So we're very happy with that. In that we simulated and we looked at the literature, what would happen if you paid direct care workers more? Basically, it would reduce turnover, it would increase quality of care, it would bring in more people into the profession and so on. We know that this happens. We have experimented this in the United States multiple times. We can do it. Pay caregivers what they're worth. All right. Other parts of the care infrastructure, we will ultimately have a serious conversation in this country and probably in most other countries about long-term care insurance and what that means. For us, private, at least in the United States, private long-term care insurance is dead. Like the idea we're going to bring this back and the financial market's going to figure this out. The financial market really doesn't want to do anything with that. They're like, you do this, government, yeah. All right. Long-term care insurance, we have an experiment in Washington State. It's the only state that had it. Maine had a referendum that failed, but eventually this will come back. Those are the policy levers. They're realistic. Some of them were sort of big, but let me end on a final note. We have a presidential discussion, presidential debate campaign right now. In fact, President Trump, when he ran the second time, was actually pushing, largely because of his daughter, to spend more money on care infrastructure and not just childcare. They were actually seriously looking at elder care. President Trump is obviously not talking about anything in substance other than hate against immigrants, but Vice President Harris, we know is sort of for her care, and she does talk about it. Care beyond childcare is an issue for her. Housing seems to be the other domestic issue that she's really strong on. So if she wins, I would imagine, for those of you who pay attention to US politics, something called, it was part of the Build Back Better proposal. Then it was Senator Casey from Pennsylvania took it over as Better Pay, Better Care. And it's a $400 billion for over a 10-year infrastructure proposal for long-term care. And I would imagine that to make a comeback if she wins. All right, thank you very much.
Yesterday, we started our discussion about old age and women, pulling the risks of old age women's economic security issues and pension schemes. It was wonderful to see all the policy approaches, so new to me. Thanks a lot. We will continue with the discussion session at Julia from Sapienza University.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have the problem here. Can you see me? Yeah, this problem now. So thank you so much. It was really interesting to where you. I couldn't see that, but it's really interesting to look at this data and the United States situations that I didn't know a lot about that. So first of all, let me say that what I learned, because here there are a lot of empirical evidences, and this is the strength, I think, of this paper, to give data about this kind of evidence of structural impediments that all women experience in the workplaces, to advance and to re-enter in the workplaces. So first of all, we have the occupational segregation, so meaning that most frequently old women experience more segregated in the labor market, in jobs that has lower wages, occupation that doesn't have a low occupational mobility. So I love this fact to put also the occupational mobility score as well as the share of feminization of the sectors. As has already said, one of the main barriers is also that they have less access to the training in the workplaces that could be really relevant for them to advance or to stay in their positions. They also experience, and this is something that was really interesting for me to look at, higher age discriminations than men do. And I think that is really interesting, this graph about how many women and men started in new job positions and receive a promotions, and this huge gap is evident. It's a simple data, but it's really effective to see that. And of course, something that we discussed is all these days, the previous days, we have even in the older age, a gender gap in unpaid care activities, so that should be free. Policy recommendation that has been put it in mainly in the paper that I wrote, that I read in online, is of course in the direction of have more legal protection against age discrimination in hiring and advancing, and legal structures. So investing more in training, educational programs, mainly tailored for old women, and most of all, very interesting to raise federal minimum wages. So my suggestions, most of all are ideas to put on the table and to see, and to, maybe look at other dimensions that could be put it in this report and access. So first of all, a matter of clarification. So who are these old women? Because actually in the paper you say that old women are those women that age 55 years old or older. How did you choose this age? And maybe I think I'm not from the United States, maybe there is something that is applying for the legislations, the working age and so on. So maybe it would be interesting for people that are not from the United States to know how you define the age, the old, the elderly age. And my main ideas goes in the direction of, three main characterizations. So looking at these barriers that women and old women face in advancing in their job places, I would put another graph. So other data that look at the access to credit of old women. So just to see if they have the same access to financial assets to start a new business, to implement their business, because I think that I don't have any experience at the United States, but I mean, from my country, from Italy, I'm more than sure that elderly women do not have any access to credit. So if they go to the bank, they are, I mean, completely not heard about their necessity, and most of all, if they want to, I mean, start a new job or start a new business. It would be also interesting to put the COVID-19 pandemic history in this things. So mainly looking at the occupational segregations. So how does COVID affected these distributions among the different sectors? Do we have a much or less mobility in the sectors that are connected with care after the COVID-19 pandemic? We have here just the post-COVID pandemic, 2022, but what about before COVID? Something happened, and I'm sure yes, but by the way, it would be interesting to see about that. This is about the motivations, but mainly not from your presentation, but maybe from the paper that I read. There is a narrative that says that the motivation to look at this barrier and to look at the impediments of older women in the workplaces is that this means that there could be a reduction in public spending because it's connected with higher health and less health problems of women. So I will change or put in some other narrative and perspective. So meaning that the lecture that we have, how important it is for well-being, not just for public expenditure or the economic income, but how important it is also to have the strategy for an active aging of the population. That, as you already said, is a huge part of the population. So we have to be concerned about their health. Third, policy recommendations. Actually, I'm taking from, what is the debate in Europe. And so we have, of course, the same problems. And so looking at, reducing the gender gaps in income and in job security, in financial security, in economic violence, in elderly age. Let's say, policy recommendations that are on the table are quite similar. So implementing where, in countries like Italy, there is not a minimum income scheme, or increasing the minimum income scheme. So have more funds for investment in trainings mainly in financial and digital skills for women and elderly women. But we have also a focus on to let people know about the working condition around them. So to ensure that all citizens, and most of all elderly and women, knows and have and can exercise their right in the labor market. So we have this transparency directive, pay transparency directive. That means that all information about the workplaces, conditions, wages should be visible. So I have to know exactly how and which are the working conditions, the wages of people that have my same jobs, my same age, and so on. So I can voice my positions also and have the right, and it's visible, this discrimination. So maybe this, could be something that you can propose also at the United States level. And also, an active role of trade unions. So this is something that I didn't saw in the paper. So how important it is to have a social dialogue that interacts with all different social actors. And thank you so much. It was really interesting.
No security.
Yeah.
We continue with Nthabiseng. Yeah. Still from Stellenbosch University. Gender disparities to South Africa. We're going to South Africa. Gender disparities in employment security and welfare outcomes in South Africa.
Yes. There's an author missing there, Aashima.
Aashima and
Yeah, she's
Abena. Yeah, we have.
Yes. No, I'm saying on the slides, I'm just
Oh.
mentioning. Okay, thank you so much. Very good afternoon. So I'm just timing myself so that I keep to my time. Abena, myself and Aashima have been working on this as part of a bigger research project that forms part of what we're looking at between South Africa and Ghana. So if she was here, she would probably be presenting on what she's got on the Ghanaian economy. I'm just going to present on the South African aspect. But we're working on a bigger project with the Levy Institute with Thomas and Ajit, which is going to look at the econometric and the interactions between which variables and determinants affect economic security in both these countries, primarily because we have data. And we've got needs data for 5 waves from South Africa, and Ghana has similar type of, I think 3 waves, I'm not sure exactly, but I think because of the nature of the data, we can then do the analysis. So we're going to provide a little bit of a context, and there's no econometrics here. It's a lot of descriptive stats, a lot of the data that will form kind of a contextual basis for understanding what's happening in the labor market, and with the focus on employment security. So all 3 of us have been working on this since the beginning of the year, and so this is just the first set of results in the paper that we've worked on. So I won't go into the definition of employment security, except to say that really I think what we have found is that in terms of just the determination of the quality of employment security, there's various variables that we are looking at in terms of how are women particularly protected from a legislative perspective, what type of contracts do they have, and what is the relationship that they have with their employers. And so we know that there's 3 different type of categories for defining employment security. Primarily, we look at the contracts, the nature of the contracts. And so there is data that our Statistics South Africa collects in terms of from the quarterly labor force survey that looks at the type of and the nature of employment relationship between employers and employees. We're also going to look at in this contextual analysis, the governance and the legislation, and what governs employment protection, what informs employment protection in South Africa. And behaviorally, we look at the type of employment contract one has and the length that they have in terms of what the relationship with the firm. In addition to that, the definition, there's a lot of literature and research that has looked at how we define employment security. You guys are all the experts here. But really, is there certainty after leaving one job after a certain period of time that you will gain, with the same type of income, the same type of employment you had previously? Is it the same quality? Is it likely to result in better or the same, or does the employment situation actually worsen? And does it enable you to have access to income? This is informed by the type of work people are doing, the particular type of nature of work, what type of contracts you enter into. So we do detail and look at the analysis in terms of, is it part-time employment? What are people in fixed-term contracts? Are they temps or are they self-employed? These are important factors and determinants in terms of the outcomes. I think that the open-endedness of contracts is determined primarily by whether you are a part-time worker or in informal type of arrangements, and the insecurity feature is particularly worsened in these type of employment contracts and arrangements. And so with the developing nations background, we know that these risks and some of these issues are increased, particularly in time when you have economic downturns. So from a South African perspective, let me just give a little bit of background. We've had, since post-democracy, 4 primary, I'd say, economic strategies, from what we call GEAR, which was the growth, employment and redistribution at the time of former President Nelson Mandela. All of these economic growth strategies haven't been able to reach and yield their targets. Targets are what's in the navy bar at around 5 to 5.5% growth targeted on average in these periods. The next was what we call accelerated share growth initiative and skills acquisition. And again, there, like the previous regime, they reached an average target around 3.5, 3.2% on average within both of these. And then it's just gone down. If you look at the new growth path, which was the new, the best performance was the time of President Nthabiseng, who was very strong from a macroeconomic policy outcomes perspective. And you see that he had the highest growth in terms of the 2 terms he had, but we went from that averaging 3.5% to the lower 2.8. And if you look at all the economic indices that talk to redistribution, whether it's poverty, inequality, and also income wealth distribution, they worsen with GDP. And if you look at the new development plan, which is what is being used, or the national development plan rather, as the growth strategy, which is really a vision, but it's still being used in terms of targets for 2030, we're hitting at around 1.2. So you can see there that from an economic expansion perspective and growth perspective, there is nothing to really spread the wealth. As a result, you see very high levels of unemployment. Our unemployment level is measured with the narrow definition and the expanded definition. The expanded definition, which includes those who what we call discouraged work seekers, I'll show you some of the numbers, much higher, at around 9 percentage points higher. 33% is when you exclude them. It obviously is quite significant, and I'll show you the gender disparities around that. The youth unemployment is quite high at 59% as well. For me, that's crisis levels. Poverty higher for majority of the population, and the GDP is really constrained. We're not growing. And I think it's primarily on the back of the type of growth we have had as a country. The real thing I want to show here, if you focus on the quarter at the bottom left, you'll see there that more than half of the population, though they go to school from grade R, or what you call early childhood education, less than half actually finish. Of those, 7% go to university, or 6%, 6.4 go to what we call further education colleges or technical vocational colleges, where you use your hands more, you do more technical training, equivalent to technical colleges. And that means that if you look at the percentage of the working population that is actually employed, it's a very low proportion. If you look at the percentage of women and the number of, in fact, if you look at the reliance on social grants, it's gone up to 17 million. Last year, it was at 18 million. The result is the number of people living in poverty is quite significant. The asset wealth distribution is quite unequal, with more than 90% of the asset wealth earned by 10% of the population. And it's very racially disaggregated. Usually it's white, the white percentage of the population that is in that 10%. And women earn 30% less than men for the same work. If I go into the detail of the economic insecurity issues and what drives them, you'll find that the actual deregulation of the labor market are significant drivers. A lot of the macro strategies, particularly those 3 that I spoke to, and the drivers of GEAR, the drivers of the New Growth Path, and also ASGISA, a lot of the neoliberal frameworks from a capital market perspective, from a monetary policy perspective, really open up the markets, make sure that the legislative framework for less rigid markets, if we talk about trade and trade openness, we went to the extra mile. If you look at the institutional framework for employee relations, anything that was seen as a hindrance to multinationals, FDI coming in, anything that was seen as a resistance, labor unions were seen really as a resistance, and were resisted rather, at the expense then of some of these securities that would be afforded to workers. I think you have to look at the application of these, of course, across different sectors, but I think the provisions on the law, though they are there, and we can talk to what we call the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, that cover, dismissals and retrenchments, and the laws and frameworks around severance, the actual access to these is problematic. And so you find that the jurisdiction in some sectors is not necessarily applied the same if you don't have unionization. The substantiveness of these measures and the coverage, if you're a farm worker and a seasonal farm worker versus someone who works in an industry like manufacturing, where there's more trade unions, particularly where there's cars or the auto sector, where there's more organized, there's a difference in the application and the access to some of these benefits. We also noted that for pregnancy and maternity periods for female workers, the application differs, though the law does protect you and guarantees you access to severance pay and unemployment insurance. Accessing that is another thing altogether, because of the capacity of the Department of Labor, which is mandated and responsible for the disbursement of these funds. So you may access it 6 months or 12 months later after your maternity leave, which means during that time when you need it most, you have no income. So these laws and the application of these laws for income security and employment security have become problematic. I think that in addition to these, the gender norms, I think it's been spoken quite extensively over the last 2 days. And what we see here is that, again, the traditional roles apply. At times you'd be discouraged to work depending on the situation you're in. And the organizational culture is also problematic. The history of South Africa as well is problematic in that it has created sometimes barriers to enabling some of the application of these. So the legislation is quite comprehensive in the country. We've got strong regulation enforcing and also setting, I'd say, market conditions for employment, for the conditions across all sectors except for your intelligence and defense force that isn't covered there. But the basic conditions of employment in the Employment Equity Act are there to deal with redress because of the apartheid laws, and also the Skills Development Act and the Levies Act, which take levies from firms, put them in a fund and disperse them so that you can improve the skills across the trajectory of the country. So let me just get to some of the data. The UIF is there as well. So just in terms of the characteristics of the labor market, of the 15 to 64-year-olds, we have a population of around 41 million. Of those, let me show you the graph. Actually, it's much better like this. 9 million men are employed, less women at 7.4. And you also have more women, 4.1 million women unemployed than the men. However, if you look at the discouraged work seekers, those who have given up looking for work, 1.7 million women versus the 1.5 million men. And non-economic active is quite a wide number for the women versus the men. At around 1.9 million more. So this is quite substantive. If you look at the labor force participation rate, there's always a gap. Since the time we started collecting this from the labor force survey, you find that though the gap has narrowed from that gap there that you see, which was almost 12%, you see it has narrowed down slightly to just around 9% between men and women now. At around men's labor force participation is always high at 65 to the female participation at 55. Absorption rate is also a 9 percentage point difference between the females and the male. So unemployment effectively would see that men have a high level of employment than women, or rather, let me say, the unemployment rate of women is at a 5%, 3 to 5% difference since 2008. That line there that you see at the top is youth. So what it's telling you is that there are systemic issues, structural issues that are constantly, the policies we have are unable to deal with the inequality over the history of South Africa's post-democracy economic situation. We know that South Africa's inequality fares very poorly in terms of the Gini, and I think that these drivers are showing the poor outcomes. I just want to focus with I think I have about 2 minutes, on the employment protection measure. There's an EPLEX indicator that the ILO does measure. We were able to use it, though it's very limited in what it covers, it's more terminations. And so we compared Ghana and South Africa's, and the reason for this we looked at as well, there's the issue of remedy, severance pay, the notice periods. We do a comparison in the paper, but I've just focused here on South Africa's, but just for purposes of time, you can see that on the remedy, South Africa fares worse than the Ghanaians. But on the prohibition for dismissal because of the strong labor laws and the basic condition of employment and the notice period that must be given, you can see that we fare better. And on the procedural notification requirements, we are the same. So if you look at access to benefits, the paper will detail, from a sectoral perspective. I look at the primary sector, private households, because we've got a large portion of women who work in households as domestic workers. And we also have our formal working sector. I take manufacturing, which is highly unionized, versus finance as examples. And you can see that the benefits and the access, for an example, medical aid, in agriculture or in private households, very few people have access to those type of benefits vis-a-vis in the formal sector of manufacturing and in finance. People that access leave, whether it's sick leave or paid leave, much higher in the formal sectors. very poorly so in private households, and a little bit better in agriculture at 45 versus the 23% in private households. The nature of the contracts, permanent nature versus the limited duration, again, you find that the informality, or in the primary sectors, it's worse, particularly in private households. And domestic workers probably are the largest number of employed workers as a sector in South Africa at around 1 million. The hours worked. Interestingly, you find that from 2009 to last year, the data that the Labour Force Survey is giving us is that in the less hours of work, you can see that the gender gap, where you find that females are working more than males, is where you're working less than 40 hours a week. The minute you begin to look at more hours than that, you find that men are working far more, and the extent to which they're working far more is quite sizable, where it's more than 40 hours a week to more than 45, where there's overtime. So by law, we're supposed to work about 40 hours. Just in terms of background, the contribution by sectors, you'll note the primary sector, the secondary sector has really been flat. And why I mention this is that the services sector has grown astronomically in the South African economy. And I think when you talk about why some of the economic insecurity issues perpetuate, some of the sectoral reasons, you'd think that because people would move or migrate to services, more women would be employed, but this has not been the case in the South African example. So this is the last slide. What is the way forward? So we've got a lot of work to do. In the paper, we're going to look at probably the regulation and legislation versus practice, the analysis on the informal sector, looking at the actual NIDS survey and the issue of salaried workers versus the self-employed, identifying some variables to measure the extent of income security. And I just put on the right there where we fare as Africa against the world, and also how the variables are not as different as they are. This is the Ipek index, but I think we must link. There's another regulation index, the CBR, that we discovered that we could use to, expand the discussion. But I think that from a policy perspective, we're going to then do the empirical estimations to try and give a flavor or understand better what are the labor market linkages to some of these strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Ruth Badru from Bristol. She's going to have 10 minutes again. I think we're only 2 minutes away. Not too bad.
Okay, don't worry, I'll keep this one very short. Time myself as usual. Okay, I feel like everyone who's done a discussion so far without slides has felt the need to apologize. So I feel compelled to apologize, even though I never plan to use slides. Well, do you mind if because I tend to walk around a lot, sorry. I just imagine this is my classroom, maybe all my students. Yeah, so I obviously, like every very organized human being in the world, I decided to read this paper last night and I've had it for over a week. But the interesting thing when I was reading it was I had like my pen and paper on my table to take notes and give her all the good points to work on, and somehow forgot, and then finished reading the paper and forgot that I was supposed to be working because I was supposed to be discussing the paper. So I think that's just a testament to how much I enjoyed reading it. And one thing I would say that I did, although some of the context that you've just given now makes so much more sense, and the whole paper makes so much more sense in some, I'll tell you why I said that. When I was reading the paper, I felt like it was part of, when you're reading a typical research paper, you feel like there's a hypothesis, there's some questions that they want to answer, and this is how they test the hypothesis. But reading the paper, it almost felt like, well, we want to talk about women's disparities in employment security, and here is a very rich discussion to really discuss, to kind of give me an idea of what the complexities are. So I felt like I was learning about women's employment security in South Africa as opposed to it being a hypothesis testing. And it makes sense now knowing that this is part of a larger project that you're all working on. So I thought there were really many great talks about the paper. In fact, I feel like you've also stolen a bit of my thunder because most of the things that I was going to recommend, you've already said you're planning to do that. So I don't know, maybe I'll just say them for the sake of saying them. But in terms of the paper, my understanding of what the paper
was just a really given, like I said, a very detailed background about what employment security is like in South Africa, especially in the South African context, comparing it with countries like India and China. And I think it was really helpful for someone who is not really familiar with the literature to understand sort of other terms, for example, that are conflated with employment security, like job or income security, thinking about how it's measured at the macro and meso level. And I think Nthabiseng talking about contracts, governance, and behavioral indicators as well that help give an idea of the level or degree of employment insecurity in South African case. And I think one of the things that the paper really did very well was give us a really good, I'll say, bridge the gap between the institutional factors or the frameworks and gender norms and how those sort of relates together to paint a very clear picture of what is driving employment insecurity in this South African context, and also kind of throw light on, in some sense, on, I would say, sort of like the expectations, the cultural expectations on women in terms of their responsibility in providing unpaid care work, and how that also influences their employment choices and employment outcomes. And the fact that women are also concentrated in the informal sector, I think that was a very big part of the paper as well, and how that also drives this whole relationship. And I think one of the good things I also noticed was the fact that there was this clear distinction about how institutional factors or structural factors, like even labor laws, could have this paradoxical effect on women's long-term employability, where at the end of the day, even though these labor laws are supposed to enable women or improve their employment outcomes, it ends up not having the intended outcomes in the long run. And also how individual characteristics like age or gender sort of affects employment security in the South African context as well. So yeah, like I said, the paper it gave me, I felt like I was reading something that I was learning from, and because it really didn't answer a specific research question, it just felt like it gave a really detailed background of the context of employment security or insecurity in South Africa. The one comment or recommendation I was going to give was to kind of throw in some empirical analysis, and being an empirical macroeconomist, maybe that's my bias, but it's also great to hear that Nthabiseng is already thinking about that, and just sort of thinking about, and I thought one of the good things that the empirical analysis could do was really bring out those sort of risk factors that are driving this employment insecurity, thinking about not just age, which you mentioned, but delving into it. Also thinking about household composition, thinking about things like the sector of employment. I know you talked about it in the final slide broadly, but just sort of bringing out those key attributes or key sectoral compositions of women. Where are they mostly employed in? How is that maybe driving employment insecurity in those sectors? Is it really about education? Is it because of the informality of the work? And another thing that I thought might be important to explore is technology. And I know this is particularly a case for Nigeria, where the gig economy is growing much faster, and a lot of women are finding this to be a better alternative than maybe self-employment, especially women of a younger generation who are able to enter the sectors. And I just wondered, because I know at times in the South African context, technological advancements are probably slightly faster than in Nigeria. I wondered if that was something that might show up as well in terms of concentration in the gig economy. And I thought also regional differences. Oh, geez, I thought, wow, I'm surprised. Okay, I will shut up. Last point, regional differences was also something that I thought might be a good thing to throw out there in the South African context, because I'm sure different regions might probably should have different. I really thought I would take like 4 minutes. I'm very surprised. Thank you.
So the reason I have in parentheses and Turkey is because originally when I got the invitation from the Levy, when Ajit wrote me, this paper, our paper with Izaskun, which is on Spain, was in the process of undergoing the review with feminist economics. But about a month ago or 2 months ago, after the Levy program had already been finalized, we received the word that it has been accepted for publication. So in that sense, in order not to be only presenting a paper that's forthcoming shortly, I thought that I would put together with my previous work, and let me actually go to it. There were 2 other papers on Turkey with different data sets on the similar issue, one published in Turkish and one in English. They were actually the inspiration behind the Spanish paper. And when now we bring all the findings and the insights gained from these 2 different contexts and data sets, I feel, or Izaskun and I feel, is leading towards a research agenda of some sort, an interdisciplinary one at the intersection of feminist economics, political science, electoral studies, and paid work and unpaid work. So that's what I decided. Instead of just purely presenting the Spanish paper, I decided, I would sort of, share with you this sort of new proposed analytical framework looking at the interactions between what we call economic gender gaps and political gender gaps. Let me, I think, do I use this? No? It's not moving. Okay. So let me start off with my original motivation for why I became involved in working with electoral data from a gender perspective. So in Turkey in the 2000s, we are observing the rise of political Islam, which actually has its roots in the 1994 local elections, where Erdogan was elected as the mayor of Istanbul for the first time, and then became the prime minister, the head of government in 2002 general elections. And then there were several rounds of other elections, as you know. He's been around for a long time now. And in the 2000s, when in a number of interviews, he and his aides and people from his party were pointing out to the role of women, particularly the women's branch of the Justice and Development Party, for having a very important role in the outcome of the elections, in their electoral success. So you see a number of quotations from Erdogan himself and one of his principal aides throughout the years, and then finally an important policy think tank in a 2014 report also underlines how women's support for the Justice and Development Party and Erdogan as the leader has played a crucial role over time in him consolidating his success and power in Turkey. So therefore, for people like me, as a feminist, as activists working in the field, but also in research, the question arises: does Turkish election survey data really confirm what these people are claiming, that women, as compared to men, have more support for Erdogan's policies, conservative policies for his party? And for his party. I mean, for sure, the women's branch is very active. He's the women's branch of the Justice and Development Party. But what does the overall election data show? Is there really a gender political gap? So I started playing around with electoral data, and what I started finding was, in fact, it was the women who identified as full-time homemakers who have the highest propensity to vote for Erdogan, whereas women in employment, on the contrary of all groups, had the lowest propensity to vote for Erdogan. So it wasn't women overall, but there was a sort of a gender polarization, intra-gender polarization in terms of support versus opposition for the Justice and Development Party or for conservative politics altogether. And when I started, so this was all very, empirically driven, only on the basis of Turkish elections. So of course, then I started looking at, looking for literature from other countries, from other contexts. And this is the seminal work by Engelhardt and Norris, who have the so-called and much referenced developmental theory of gender political gaps, where using empirical data over a long span of time from Western democracies, they find that there is a gradual transformation of the gender political gap from a traditional, what they name as a traditional gender political gap, whereby women place themselves more right and conservative than men, towards gradually a modern gender political gap, whereby in these Western democracies, data shows women start shifting to the left of men. They describe this through structural drivers such as declining fertility, increasing education and female labor force participation, and cultural drivers as well. But in this data, with multiple countries from the Western democracies, Italy, Spain, and Luxembourg are the three countries where the traditional gender political gap persists for this period. So given that what I was finding with Turkish data, that women's work status made a difference in terms of, whether there was support for Erdogan or not, I started going further into literature that particularly looked at the female labor force participation as a driver of any gender political gaps. And there are a number of papers. There's a preceding paper by Topi, and so for limitations of time, I'm not going to dwell on all of the literature, but that find further with different data sets for different time periods, for different countries, that find a correlation between women's increasing labor force participation and support for left politics. In a recent study by Gethin, Martinez, Toledano, and Piketty, there's an interesting finding which basically says that 21 Western democracies between 48 and 2020, while it used to be the case in the earlier part of this data that low-educated, low-income, working-class men relative to higher-educated, higher-income voters and women used to support left politics, these ideological profiles seem to be undergoing full reversal. So that sort of also brings in renewed interest also in the economics literature on what's happening with these political polarizations and determinants of political preferences. So I should say, whenever at the individual level, if there's any control for work status in these regression analysis, in these models, that work status is controlled for being in the labor force, being employed and unemployed versus the rest of the categories. And homemakers are not taken, homemaking or unpaid engagement, full-time in unpaid work is not taken as a separate category. One of the main explanations as to why increasing labor force participation or engagement in the labor market would put women more to the left of men is that the engagement in labor market, these discussions suggest, facilitates experiences of discrimination not only by class but also by gender, and an inclination towards left politics by women. Looking at the Turkish literature, the regression analysis with various electoral data from Turkey showed either no clear gender political gap, basically saying what Erdogan and his aides are claiming is not true on a statistical level, or when they did find some gendered pattern in voting behavior for Turkey, they were saying that education and to some extent labor force participation seemed to have more impact on determining women voters' political preferences than they seem to have, than the impact they had on men. So I've already told you what the previous two studies found. So when we run the model with no controls for work status, there is a traditional gender political gap. Or when we include only the conventional work status variable of employed versus unemployed and the rest, what we found was for data coming up all the way to 2017 that there is a traditional gender political gap. Women as an overall category tend to support Erdogan more. But when we entered homemaking status and distinguished categories, what we found was that that traditional gender gap disappeared, and it was really the homemakers having the highest propensity to support conservative politics, and women in employment having a negative propensity, the lowest propensity. So what I concluded on the basis of Turkish analysis is that there is a simultaneous traditional gender political gap and a modern gender political gap with two groups of women, basically. Rather than there being an overall transformation, and that work status is an important determinant of the intra-gender polarization between paid and unpaid work. And then there was a similar study around the same time by Barisione for Italy, called Debunking the Myth of a Traditional Gender Gap in the Electoral Support for Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, where he looks at the exact same thing and finds that once you enter homemaker as an analytical category, women's overall support for Berlusconi disappears. It's really the women who are in the full-time homemaking who are supporting Berlusconi, and women in employment, just on the contrary, having negative support for Berlusconi for that time period. So, the why of this, of course, is important. I don't have data on this, but it's more qualitative data. So on the basis of the Turkish context, the discussion basically emphasizes how it was for the first time with Erdogan as a conservative leader running on a policy agenda of family values that the unpaid work became an agenda item. It became visible because he was, in all of his speeches, he was making an emphasis on women's roles as mothers and wives, and elevated the unpaid care worker status and recognized his contribution to the family, to the society and nation at the highest level. But without challenging the gender division of labor, just on the contrary, saying this is a very important contribution what women are making, and they should continue doing this. And this was then on a material basis joined or supported by economic and social policies for subsidizing women's unpaid work through social and cash transfers targeting women homemakers, who then became one of the most important supporters in his electoral base. So where is the macroeconomics? I said I promised that I would throw in some macroeconomics into this, and this is where the macroeconomics comes, giving an emphasis to macroeconomic growth patterns. What happens with the employment generation of growth when it is a weak performance? Then women are basically pushed back into their secondary roles as housewives, as homemakers, rather than being pulled into the labor market in a labor market with few jobs, and gender economics gaps increase. There's a high share of homemakers amongst the female electorate, leading to the traditional gender political gap and leading to higher probability of conservative and populist governments and politics, which then leads to all these economic and social policies which support the role of women as wives and mothers, which then further lead to persisting widening gender economic gaps and institutionalizes the male breadwinner, female carer household, and what I call results in adverse path dependency and vicious cycles. The opposite is when the employment generation performance of growth is strong, And when I was presenting this at Sapienza University, when I was working with Julianne Marcella at the time, Izaskun Zuazu was also there as a postdoc. And I said, this could be the case of Spain. Like this is the previous one, the vicious cycles is the case of Turkey, and this could be the case of Spain, because Spain, after entering the EU, went through this incredible, robust growth period where with incredible job creation, where Spanish women were pulled into the labor market. And what we observe is that from the Franco period of very low female labor force participation rates, there's this really fast increase in female market activity over a relatively short period of time. And as we also know, Spain has been one of the leading countries in relatively more progressive and left politics in the European context in recent years. So I know I'm out of time. The full paper for Spain is amongst the papers. So very quickly, what we did in the case of Spain is we used left-wing political inclination as our dependent variable this time, not support for Erdogan, not support for Berlusconi, but this time for left-wing politics. And what we see is that there is a decreasing gap over time in political ideology by gender. And when we look at the political ideology, by the way, as you go further down, it's left. And when you go up on the vertical scale, it's more right. And what we also observe is that the different labor market status really makes a substantial difference, particularly for women. And when we juxtapose this against labor force participation rate increasing and share of homemakers decreasing, we also see a parallel decline in the gender gap in political ideology at the macro level. And when we run the regression analysis, the main contribution of this paper was also to do something that Ilkkaracan and Barisione didn't do, which was to integrate macroeconomic regional labor force participation data over that 30 years at the, on the basis of regions, and correct for endogeneity and look at the causality leading from robust employment generation for women to probability of any observed individual woman being a homemaker, from there to political ideology positioning, and therefore was able to provide some support for the macroeconomic underpinnings of this interaction between gender and gender economic and political gaps. And for further research, expansion of similar quantitative analysis with electoral data from other countries, but primarily also collection and analysis of qualitative data exploring why these interactions between homemaking versus being employed and support for different kinds of policies and these path dependencies that we observe on a case study basis. Thank you.
All the synergy between quantitative and the qualitative data just showed up, and we have Sarah Small, Department of Economics, University of Utah.
Thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. So thanks. It was such a pleasure to read the paper and such an honor to do so. I think since kind of talking with Ipek on the train and listening to this presentation, I read the paper in regard to Spain, but learning more about the Turkish context. My thoughts have kind of shifted a little bit, but I'll still show you some slides here. So first of all, congrats on the acceptance of the paper. Because the paper has been accepted, I don't really want to nitpick the paper for things, and I think it's better to kind of think about future work. So that's my plan for my discussant comments, but I do really want to highlight, I think Ipek really talked nicely about kind of how this is situated in the literature, but I really want to highlight the contribution. And the main contribution that I was particularly excited by was that it considers this kind of more nuanced measure of occupational groups. And I include this quote from the paper at the bottom, which says, studies which assume women as homogenous categories in analysis of gender and political ideology can be biased. Using estimations on the basis of homogenous subset of our sample consisting of women and men in the labor force, we do not find a statistically significant gender gap in political positioning. And so, going backwards here, I think like one thing that I really think is important about that contribution, right, is very much in line with some of the work Julie Nelson has done on like gender aversion and risk taking, right? And like she's doing a lot of work to show that like, hey, actually like there's more differences in risk taking within genders than there is across, right? And I think we as a community need to encourage, right, more work that shows sometimes that there's not statistically significant gender differences, right? And try to really bolster those, particularly when they're contrary to mainstream literature that's trying to show all these behavioral differences by gender. I also, right, again, I think it's really timely. I spoke with Ipek a little bit about this on the train, but I think there's a lot of opportunities with this work to also think about the political polarization that's been happening, particularly by gender in South Korea, but also in the United States. And for people who are like on social media, there's been this really interesting like trad wives trend happening, where young women in particular are kind of, I think, offering really interesting critiques of kind of capitalism, right? But leaning back into, I think, this like thing that you're finding about housewives and care and all this stuff. Let's see. She's already shown this. Something I was thinking about with this figure was just how interesting the role of age also seems to be here. Right, you talk a little bit in the paper about, you know, like the retired folks and the pensioners. So that was just something I was a little bit struck by and thought might be worth investigating too. Yeah, I mean, like, I learned so much reading this paper, and there are some things that I still want to learn more about, right? Like Ipek spoke in the presentation just now, and also in the paper about how, right, in that first half of the 20th century in particular, in many countries, women were more conservative broadly, and I'm just so curious about what's going on there. They also, right, have a measure in their models about kind of working class, and it made me think about, right, like the intersection of class and this thing about housewives in particular, and like, I think people are housewives for different reasons in different class groups, right? And so that might also be an interaction worth kind of digging into. There's so much exciting work to do here. The transmission mechanism, and you talked about this a little bit more in this presentation, particularly in the case of Turkey, but it's just so interesting to me, like what is it that is making homemakers vote in this way? And we talked a little bit in the paper and on the train about, right, like the role of cash transfers and any type of like policies and that encourage marriage. I also, as you were presenting just now, is when you were speaking about kind of making divorce more difficult, I was thinking about like the oldie but the goodie Barbara Bergman paper on the economic risks of being a housewife, right? And like, I was like, oh man, I wish I had like reread that and thought about those connections a little bit more, but good. Let's see, I also, yeah, I mean, I think there's so much you can do with this work. I mean, it's so exciting. I think the strength of the Spanish data that's so interesting is that you have the Likert scale. So I think it'd be kind of interesting to think about those questions of polarization and like, are the housewives kind of maybe even more like radical conservative or less, or I just don't know. I'm kind of curious. I think we could think about that in a lot of different country contexts, like you've suggested. And then like when I first kind of opened the paper and started reading it, and you were talking about kind of the occupation groups and like this big contribution that you're making, I was really thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool to also like, and I wonder if there is literature on this, I just don't know, but to look at like just the role of occupations and like the type of work that economic growth might be spurring. And so, right, like if women are, in that case of Spain, like you're talking about with the virtuous cycle, right, like what does it matter the type of jobs, right, to spur that virtuous cycle is, I guess, my point. So anyway, that's kind of all I had to say, but congratulations and thank you.
We'll have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you know, for the discussion. Yes, please, Selena, back in there, and Tom. Okay. A panelist will come forward. I'm sorry, yeah. Let me wait for the panelists first and then Indira. Yes.
Okay, I'm good for
She's asking me to answer.
Is it?
I'm talking about South Africa, what's happening in South Africa. You know, when an economy has such a huge unemployment rate, like you have youth unemployment rate, overall unemployment, the first thing one has to do about employment security for employment security is change the development path. Unless you have employment intensive development path, you cannot solve the problem. I don't know whether it's feasible, it has to be feasible, but if it is politically infeasible, then it's a luck. Like in India, we need employment intensity development path, but that's not happening. And that means that you have to support labor intensive sectors, which is the first requirement. Second thing is that if you want women to come out, maybe these are my suggestions, that women have to be relieved from their unpaid work as far as possible, unpaid domestic work. That's another requirement. And studies have shown this again and again, that if you give them required facilities, childcare facilities, etc., then women may come out and participate in this work. A third point is, that again, based on India, that we have plenty of skill training programs, but unless skill training programs are tailored and targeted, they are not likely to be very successful. Because general training doesn't match with demand in the economy, and that's what happens. And finally, I would like to suggest employment guarantee program. You have employment guarantee programs, whatever. Yeah. Now, employment guarantee program basically will help in two ways. One is that it will generate assets that will increase the labor absorbing capacity of the mainstream economy. So if you select the asset like that, it will. And secondly, if you can select assets which reduces women's unpaid work through employment guarantee program, then employment guarantee program, these two objectives will be very effective. But I would like to know what happened to your employment guarantee program, which you had. I think it's no more there, perhaps. I don't know.
Thank you, Indira. We had Mina first, Tom, and then I'll give you. Tom.
Thank you. My comments are to Christian on the paper presented, and I completely agree with Julia. So this is kind of complementary with what she said. I mean, in the United States, I don't know why you chose the age of 55, because if I did my job at 55 for the right choice or that I have to be picked out, I'm not getting anything unless I have a disability, right? So why not start from 62 at least to get some of the social security, or better yet, 65, they have Medicare coverage, or wait until 67 when there is the full social security, and then the woman would find that this is not enough and she's forced to work. I think that makes a lot, in my view, makes a lot more sense. The second thing is about occupations. It's much easier to find a job at Stop and Shop in Boston or Macy's. That's one thing. Then find a job with the MBTA, for example, or driving a subway or working in offices. So I think the segregation by occupation would give us a better.
Thank you. And Tom?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts for Christian. One was that when you're talking about working longer, I think there's a real class aspect of that you have to take into consideration. So some occupations, people want to work longer, some they don't. Right. And occupational segregation was interesting too for older women, because I've done some work about Black women versus white women in the US, and Black women's occupational segregation is much greater than for white women. So it might be interesting to break it down by that too, the sample sizes are big enough. For heck, I had 42% Kurdish voters voted for the JDP, 42%.
In the first round.
Okay. And the other thought I had
But
was.
we didn't look at Kurdish women versus men and homemakers separately, that's
Yeah,
a.
yeah, but so the thing that struck me though was, I remember when I was first looking at labor force participation rates in Turkey for women, there was a strong correlation between education and labor force participation, and I was wondering how much that might be affecting results.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, we have questions, online questions?
Yes, we do have a question from Zoom. For Weller, have you considered life cycle analysis to show the intersectional gendered effects across the life cycle for various demographic groups? And do unionized sectors, for example, public school teachers, differ? Is collective bargaining a solution? Also, one more popped up as I was speaking, a comment. For Ipek, it is a great paper based on the rich data, highlighting the casual relationship between being a female homemaker and political stance is interesting, but what is the theory or mechanisms behind this causality?
Thank you. And one last question, no, one more. Yeah. And again, yeah, yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is partly taken into account by Prof. Indira, but given the high youth unemployment rate in South Africa, I was wondering if talking about employment security is not analytical bias. I mean, what is the place of active labor markets in the context of South Africa, given the situation you described? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So congratulations to all of you. I have a question for Ipek. Did you explore the role or the perceptions or the vote of young men in Spain? Young men. So because I don't remember who published a research very impactful nationally about perceptions, saying that between the range of 16 to 24 years old, 44% of young men believe that we went too far in gaining women's rights and benefits and reducing discrimination. We went too far. This is one factor. And the other one is how the anti-feminist identity, it is now part of this polarization in young men in particular. So for them, the point is to keep and preserve this anti-feminism over whatever negotiable, reasonable kind of thing. And the other question is, why do you think that in the other research about women's workers, why they are kind of changing the direction of the vote and going towards voting the right wing? Why men workers are changing this kind of, this is in USA also trends.
Thank you.
Yes, just to follow up on Raquel's question, because the homemaker is a figure that has shrunk. I mean, it's a population group now, demographic that has kind of again disappeared or really shrunk, except for some countries that still have traditional values. But yet we have a re-emergence of right wing, and typically has been associated not with the being in the labor market, not being in the labor market, but on the working conditions of and the disenfranchisation. You say like that? I mean this in particular, these young men whose only alternative is to peddle and distribute with I mean, food in Latin American cities, for example. So again, so it might be an explanation for a certain place in a certain context, but we are seeing something that cannot or hasn't been associated to the homemaker and the women and men currently in other contexts.
Thank you, Valeria. We'll have 3 minutes each.
All right, I'll respond very quickly. There's 2 points. Thank you very much for all the comments. So let me see what I can respond to 3 of them. You got to remember that this is not an academic paper. This is written for a think tank. And when you write for a think tank, there's always sort of the tension. How much do you stuff in or how much do you hold back to get another bite at the apple? So it was very nice to hear from you that you said we should write about credit. We're not going to write about credit access, we're going to write about wealth, which is in the US context a little bit more relevant, and we also have the data for it. So that will be part of it. When you talked about the financing stuff, the public support, there is a separate paper that talks about the Older Americans Act and its financing, which has shrunk over time. So we already have those. Now, the same comment goes to why we have the 55-year-old cutoff. I can make up whatever economic experience I want for it. There is an economic explanation in the data at 55. That's when, for men and women, labor force participation start dropping down. And it's unclear what these people are doing until they qualify for Social Security. They may have pensions, they may have a spouse, they may have some inheritances. It also cuts in weird ways with class. But the other part is we need to communicate to non-economists. And non-economists are used to seeing prime age as 25 to 54, and then older 55 to 64, and really old 65 and plus. That's the simplest explanation. That's why we're using it, why we're not changing the terms here. The same comment to we want to have another bite at the apple. That's why we didn't include race and ethnicity. And it's simply, there are sort of clear cuts, especially when we did the work on care work. That's when race and ethnicity really come out blatantly. But we just, like in a report, in a policy brief, you want to hold back some data, you want to focus on the main story. And the goal here is really to like fight ageism and sexism at the same time with multiple things. At least that's sort of how we approach it at the Center for American Progress. I know other people do it in a different way. You want to have one big report that covers everything. That's not what we did in this time. Oh, finally, I wanted to make a point that you raised about posting gender issues. From a policy perspective, the question is, all right, how are you going to get that into the workplaces and how do you make sure it's enforced? We have sort of every workplace you go in the United States has to pose minimum wage laws. Makes no difference, I think, in real life. There is a proposal coming out of that lesson to use the stock market, and the stock market is very pervasive in the United States, unlike it is in other countries. To basically require companies to post how much money they're spending on training, what their pay differences are, and so on and so forth, as part of their listing requirements for every year when they report to Wall Street. It's a very uniquely American approach to something like reporting requirements, but it would at least capture the biggest employers. Sorry.
Sorry. Just, we have 6 minutes left. So sorry. Thank you. Please complete your.
No, I'm done.
You were done?
Okay, that was it.
Sorry.
Okay. Sarah, thank you so much for your comments. I'm presuming that you will share the PowerPoint with me. I took some notes, but I think the further exploration of housewives with different socioeconomic class groups is a very good proposition. We can do an interaction with education. Most of the electoral data doesn't contain information data on household income. But there are some socioeconomic class differentiators, so we can look at the interactions. And of course, coming both from your comments and Valeria's, the type of jobs, the type of employment is a very important aspect about in terms of how this gender polarization is shaped. So I think those are 2 further areas to explore. But just to finish up on Valeria's comment on the homemakers becoming a declining share of the electorate in in some countries, yes, in many countries not. In South Asia, the MENA region, Turkey, there are substantial. But even then, just given the very small margins that we observe in electoral results in the US, which became such a huge issue, in the most recent elections in Turkey, Erdogan just won by 1 percentage point. In Brexit recently, so even that little bit of inclination that we find 7 to 8% higher propensity of homemakers to vote conservative can bring about, has the possibility to affect the outcome. So I think it may still be from a quantitative perspective worth considering. There was a question from online about the mechanism behind the causality. I think I tried to explain it, and there's more in it, more of this in the Spanish paper as well, that homemaking is a particular economic status that creates a dependency that immerses one in fully unpaid work. So you have long work hours, but in terms of cash income, you're dependent on the main breadwinner. What Sarah brought out about the economic risks of being a housewife from Bergman's famous article. So it comes with it's a particular economic status that comes with its own workload and risks and dependencies and financial risks. So therefore, the idea is that such a group of electorate would respond to different kinds of policies. So a work-life balance policy doesn't affect as much as a cash transfer policy, for instance. Yeah, sorry.
We have a minute to answer all the questions. So I'll be quick. I think, thank you, Indira, for the points on what policy recommendations can be executed to deal with unemployment. Unemployment is the biggest failure of any of the post-democratic governments in South Africa, particularly the ruling party. All the points you've made about employment intensity, the leading woman and the skills development approach, I mean, these are things that we've tried to do. The problem is that the massification of these programs, including the expanded public work program, which is what you're asking about, it has been executed since 2004. 14 million people have been employed, they get a certain amount of income. The problem is that the number of people that enter the labor market, as you've seen, vis-a-vis the number of people that are employed and also active, economically active, there is a huge mismatch. The number of kids that go to school and enter into post-school or matric, post-matric, which is your post-school into university or technical colleges, there's too few vis-a-vis those that get employed, vis-a-vis those that enter into these public employment programs. So the scale at which they need to be done, but also the structural issues in the economy in terms of the formal versus the informal and the number of people that can be absorbed is inadequate, wholly inadequate. So I think these are problems that have to be resolved. I think there are recommendations and various reports that I've done in the country, just dealing with the sectors that are employment intense, that are labor absorptive. These are the contracting sectors. But also the rural areas is where you have to have systemic changes in infrastructure. There are a lot of enablers that will help economic activity, whether it's access to finance, microfinance, but also just basic infrastructure at a municipal level, and these are dismal things. I think in terms of the question Abu asked, you have to deal with the labor market biases, but I think that you have to have a context. If you understand that the insecurity is worsened primarily because of the contextual issues. If you lose your job, you're unlikely to secure another one, even secure the income. But people have been, we have what we call chronic unemployment, where people have been unemployed for very long and extended periods of time. So you have to understand these so that when you do the econometrics, I think the points that Ruth made, thank you for those. And I think we'll consider, especially that technological, the gig economy, in some kind of variable that looks at how this can help improve outcomes. I think Aashima, maybe something from you.
No, I think you've covered just to Ruth's point about the adding econometrics. So I'm not sure if we explicitly mentioned, but this was just the literature survey part.
Yeah.
And it's in 3 phases, so we're still continuing the econometrics. Happy to share. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Big applause.